What do you do when the thing you prayed for finally arrives, only to reveal the flaws you hoped no one would ever see? And how do you handle being chosen for greatness while feeling unworthy on the inside? These questions tug at every human heart, and they echo through the rise and fall of Israel's first king, Saul. Before Saul ever lifted a crown, Israel begged for a king to lead them like the other nations. God granted their request, and Saul stepped into the story, a man tall in stature but trembling in spirit. His journey begins not on a battlefield or in a throne room, but while he was searching for lost donkeys, unaware that destiny was walking toward him. When Samuel anointed him, the presence of the Holy Spirit came upon him, transforming an ordinary man into a leader chosen by God. Yet even in that divine moment, fear hid in the corners of Saul's heart, whispering that he wasn't enough. As Saul began to rule, victory after victory confirmed God's hand on his life. The people celebrated him. Songs rose in the streets. Israel finally felt secure. But beneath the applause, Saul wrestled with a deep insecurity, one that made him cling to the approval of people more tightly than the approval of God. Each triumph should have drawn him closer to God, but instead, the cracks in his character widened. When God instructed him through Samuel, Saul obeyed selectively, blending God's commands with his own judgment. The result was a throne that looked steady on the outside but was crumbling within. The turning point came when God sent Saul to destroy the Amalekites. Saul spared what God had forbidden and refused to acknowledge his disobedience. When confronted, he offered excuses wrapped in religious language. It wasn't failure that ended Saul's story, it was a heart that refused to surrender. God rejected him as king, and Saul's life spiraled into jealousy, paranoia, and eventually isolation. The man who once stood tall now stood tormented, watching the presence of God rest on another David. Saul died on a battlefield not because God abandoned him, but because Saul abandoned the heart posture God desired. Obedience rooted in trust. Saul's story reminds us that calling is not enough, character must sustain what God gives. There are moments when God elevates us, gives opportunities, opens doors, and places us in rooms we once only dreamed about. But if we carry insecurity instead of humility, we begin to build a life on the shaky foundation of people's validation. Saul teaches us that the applause of others can become a prison when we forget the voice of the one who called us. We also learn that partial obedience is still disobedience. God isn't after performance. He's after surrender. When He asks something hard of us, it's not to burden us, it's to shape us. Saul obeyed the parts that made sense to him and ignored the parts that cost him something. In our own journey, we must guard against selective obedience, especially in areas where we feel entitled or afraid. God sees the motives beneath our actions, and He desires a heart aligned with His will. Finally, Saul's downfall reminds us that the presence of God is the true source of stability. When Saul lost the presence of the Holy Spirit, his peace evaporated. Gifts remained, position remained, but the anchor of his soul was gone. When we depend more on our abilities than on God's presence, we drift into anxiety and strive for control. But when we prioritize His presence above image, success, and applause, He steadies our hearts and guides us into purpose without fear. In the end, Saul's story is both a warning and an invitation. It warns us that talent, appearance, and opportunity cannot replace obedience, humility, and trust. And it invites us to guard our hearts, surrender our insecurities to God, and walk in step with His presence. Saul was chosen, equipped, and empowered, but he lost the battle within long before he lost the battle on the hill of Gilboa. As we reflect on his life, we're reminded that God is not looking for perfect leaders, but for surrendered ones, men and women who will let His presence shape their decisions and His voice define their worth.